In September 1260, an army that had never lost a major battle in the Middle East was about to be annihilated. The Mongols had crushed every kingdom from China to Europe. They'd burned Baghdad to ashes, slaughtered hundreds of thousands, and left a trail of terror that paralyzed entire civilizations. But in a valley near Nazareth, they were about to meet something they'd never encountered before. A general who understood their tactics better than they did, and a sultan willing to gamble everything on a single day. This is the story of how one battle destroyed the myth of Mongol invincibility, saved an entire civilization from extinction, and ended with one of history's most brutal betrayals. This is the story of Ain Jalut. To understand why this battle mattered, we need to go back 50 years before the first arrow was fired. In 1206, a Mongol chieftain named Temujin united the warring tribes of the steppes and took the title Genghis Khan, universal ruler. What followed was the most devastating military expansion in human history. The Mongols didn't just conquer territories, they transformed warfare itself. Every previous empire had been limited by logistics, supply lines, and the physical endurance of their armies. The Mongols solved these problems through revolutionary innovations that turned their entire society into a military machine. Every Mongol male was a warrior from childhood. Boys learned to ride before they could walk. By age 3, they were practicing with small bows. By age 10, they could shoot accurately from a galloping horse. By 15, they were combat-ready cavalry who could survive on almost nothing, ride for days without rest, and execute complex battlefield maneuvers with minimal communication. This wasn't an army that assembled when war was declared. This was a permanent military force that happened to have a civilian component. But the real innovation was organizational. Genghis Khan created a decimal system, where units of 10 warriors formed the basic building block. 10 tens made 100, 10 hundreds made 1,000, 10 thousands made a tumen, the core operational unit of 10,000 cavalry. Every warrior knew exactly where he fit in this structure. Orders could cascade down from the Khan to the individual soldier with remarkable speed. And most importantly, promotion was based entirely on merit, not aristocratic birth. A shepherd who showed tactical brilliance could command a tumen. This meritocracy created a military elite that was genuinely the best fighters the Mongols could produce. The Mongols also perfected intelligence gathering to a degree that wouldn't be matched until modern intelligence agencies. Before invading a region, they'd send merchants, spies, and reconnaissance units to map terrain, identify political factions, assess military capabilities, and locate resources. By the time the Mongol army arrived, they knew more about the enemy's territory than the enemy did. They knew which nobles were ambitious and could be turned. They knew which cities were poorly defended. They knew where the mountain passes were and when the rivers would be fordable. This intelligence advantage turned battles into executions. And then there was their signature tactic, the feigned retreat. Mongol cavalry would engage an enemy force, exchange a few volleys, then suddenly turn and flee in apparent panic. The enemy, seeing victory within reach, would break formation and pursue. The Mongols would lead them for miles, stretching out the pursuing force, exhausting their horses, and separating them from their support. Then, at a predetermined location, the Mongols would wheel around and the real battle would begin. Fresh cavalry would emerge from concealment on the flanks. The retreat would reverse into a charge. What had seemed like a defeated enemy would transform into a coordinated killing machine, and the pursuing force would be systematically annihilated. This tactic worked again and again because human psychology made commanders believe they were winning, right up until the moment they died. By 1220, the Mongol Empire stretched from northern China to the Caspian Sea. They destroyed the Jin dynasty, conquered the Karakatai, and were looking west. And that's when they encountered the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, controlled territory from Afghanistan to the shores of the Persian Gulf. His armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. His cities were among the richest in Asia, and he made a catastrophic diplomatic mistake that would destroy everything. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan arrived at the city of Otrar on the edge of the Khwarezmian Empire. The local governor, Inalchuk, accused the merchants of being spies and had them executed. Then he seized their goods. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding that the governor be handed over for punishment, Shah Muhammad made a decision that historians still analyze with horrified fascination. He had the lead ambassador executed and sent the others back with their beards shaved, a mortal insult in both Mongol and Islamic culture. Genghis Khan had been prepared to establish peaceful trade. After this insult, he declared total war. What followed was systematic annihilation on a scale that shocked even by medieval standards. In 1219, Genghis Khan assembled an army of 200,000 men and invaded Khwarezm. The campaign lasted 4 years and reduced one of the world's great civilizations to rubble. Bukhara fell and was burned. Genghis Khan rode into the great mosque, climbed the pulpit, and told the assembled scholars that he was the punishment of God sent to destroy them for their sins. Samarkand, a city of 500,000 people, surrendered after 5 days. The Mongols used civilians as human shields during the assault, driving them ahead of Mongol troops to exhaust defender arrows and fill moats with bodies. When the city fell, the entire population was marched onto the plains, divided by occupation and systematically slaughtered. Artisans and engineers were spared and sent east to serve the Mongol Empire. Everyone else died. Nishapur resisted for 10 days. When it fell, Genghis Khan's daughter, whose husband had been killed during the siege, personally oversaw the massacre. Every living thing in the city was killed. Humans, dogs, cats, rats, everything. The Mongols built pyramids of skulls, separate pyramids for men, women, and children, as monuments to the cost of resistance. Then they destroyed the irrigation systems that made agriculture possible, transforming productive farmland into desert. The message was clear: resist, and not only will you die, but your civilization will be erased so completely that future generations won't even know you existed. Shah Muhammad, the emperor whose pride had started this catastrophe, fled. He didn't rally his armies. He didn't organize a defense. He ran, abandoning his empire, his family, his people, and his honor. He died alone on an island in the Caspian Sea in 1220, broken by dysentery and despair, while Mongol forces systematically destroyed everything he'd ruled. His son, Jalal ad-Din, tried to organize resistance and actually won a battle against a Mongol force at Parwan in 1221. It was one of the only Mongol defeats in the entire campaign. But one victory couldn't stop the avalanche. Jalal ad-Din was hunted across Afghanistan and eventually fled to India, his cause hopeless, his kingdom destroyed. By 1223, the Khwarezmian Empire no longer existed. Historians estimate that the Mongol invasion reduced the population of Central Asia by 5 to 15 million people. Entire cities vanished from history. The region's importance in world trade never recovered. Irrigation systems that had taken centuries to build were destroyed and would take centuries more to rebuild. The physical and cultural devastation was so complete that Central Asia still bears the scars today. But the Mongols weren't finished. In 1237, they turned toward Europe. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, led an army of 150,000 warriors westward. Russia fell city by city. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, was destroyed so thoroughly that when travelers passed through years later, they reported seeing nothing but bones and ruins. Poland was invaded. Hungary was crushed at the Battle of Mohi in 1241, where 65,000 Hungarian and Croatian troops were annihilated by a Mongol force half their size. Mongol scouts reached the outskirts of Vienna. Europe was weeks away from facing the same systematic destruction that had befallen Central Asia and Russia. And then, suddenly, the Mongols withdrew. The great Khan Ogedei had died in Mongolia, triggering a succession crisis. Batu Khan took his forces back east to secure his political position. Europe was saved not by military victory, but by political accident. The withdrawal bought Europe time to prepare better defenses, and created the myth that European armies had somehow stopped the Mongols. They hadn't. The Mongols had simply decided that the succession crisis was more important than conquering more territory. But the message had been delivered: the Mongol Empire could strike anywhere, anytime, and nobody could stop them. By 1250, the Mongols controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history. From Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, Mongol authority was absolute. And then they turned their attention to the Middle East, with an ambition that dwarfed all previous campaigns. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and brother of the new great Khan Möngke, was given command of a massive army with orders to conquer everything from Persia to Egypt. This wasn't a raid or a punitive expedition. This was permanent conquest, the absorption of the entire Islamic heartland into the Mongol Empire. Hulagu Khan was a different type of Mongol commander than his grandfather. Genghis Khan had been a pragmatist who used terror as a tool, but could also be diplomatic when it served his purposes. Hulagu was ideologically committed to the destruction of Islam. His wife was a Christian, and he favored Nestorian Christians in his administration. He saw the campaign not just as territorial expansion, but as a religious mission to shatter Islamic power permanently. This made him particularly brutal, even by Mongol standards, and particularly dangerous to the Islamic world. His first target was the Assassins, the infamous Nizari Ismaili sect, that controlled a network of mountain fortresses in Persia, and had terrorized the region for 2 centuries through political murder. The Assassins were legendary for their fanaticism and their impregnable strongholds. Hulagu besieged their fortresses methodically, using Chinese engineers to build siege weapons that could reduce mountain castles to rubble. In 1256, after a campaign of several months, the assassin stronghold of Alamut fell. The entire sect was systematically exterminated. Their libraries, containing irreplaceable texts of philosophy and science, were burned. The assassins, who had survived crusades and sultanates, were wiped from existence by Mongol efficiency. Then Hulagu turned toward Baghdad. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had been the jewel of the Islamic world, the city of the caliphs, the center of learning, culture, and power. The House of Wisdom had preserved and expanded upon Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge through the medieval period. The city's libraries contained hundreds of thousands of books. Its schools taught mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy to students from across the world. The Abbasid Caliphate, while politically weakened, still represented the symbolic heart of Sunni Islam. Baghdad wasn't just a city. It was the embodiment of Islamic civilization itself. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, was weak and indecisive. When Hulagu demanded submission in 1257, the Caliph's advisors were divided. Some urged immediate surrender. Others insisted that the Muslim world would rise to defend Baghdad, that the Mongols couldn't possibly take a city of 1 million people, that Allah would not allow the destruction of Islam's holiest city after Mecca and Medina. The Caliph chose to negotiate, playing for time, hoping for rescue that would never come. Hulagu, understanding that taking Baghdad would terrify the rest of the Islamic world into submission, assembled overwhelming force. He brought perhaps 150,000 troops, along with Chinese siege engineers, Persian auxiliaries, and Christian Georgian and Armenian contingents, eager to see the Muslim capital fall. The siege began in January 1258. The Mongols surrounded the city, cutting off all escape and resupply. They breached the walls using advanced siege equipment that the city's defenders had never seen before. When Mongol troops poured through the breaches, the Caliph finally understood that no rescue was coming. He surrendered, hoping that submission would at least save lives. Hulagu accepted the surrender, ordered the Caliph to command his troops to lay down their arms, and then systematically violated every term of the agreement. What happened next remains one of the worst atrocities in human history. For a week, Mongol soldiers massacred the population of Baghdad. Estimates range from 200,000 to over 1 million dead. The House of Wisdom was destroyed, its books thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that witnesses reported the water running black with ink. Libraries that had preserved human knowledge for centuries were burned. Scholars, poets, scientists, and students were slaughtered alongside merchants, artisans, and common people. The city that had been the intellectual capital of the world was transformed into a charnel house. The Caliph himself was executed in a manner designed to respect Mongol superstition while maximizing humiliation. The Mongols believed that spilling royal blood on the ground was bad luck, so they wrapped al-Mustasim in a carpet and had horses trample him to death. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world since 750, ceased to exist. The symbolic and spiritual center of Sunni Islam was destroyed. The psychological impact on the Muslim world was devastating. If Baghdad could fall, if the Caliph could be murdered, if the holiest libraries could be burned, then what was safe? What could resist the Mongols? After Baghdad, the Mongol advance seemed unstoppable. Hulagu turned west toward Syria. Aleppo fell in 1260 after a siege that lasted barely a week. The city was sacked with the now familiar brutality. Damascus, seeing what had happened to every city that resisted, opened its gates and surrendered without a fight. The governor welcomed Hulagu's representatives, pledged loyalty, and begged for mercy. The city was spared wholesale massacre, but was occupied and forced to pay crushing tribute. Christian crusader states, which had been fighting Muslims for 2 centuries, saw the Mongol invasion as divine intervention. The Crusaders had been slowly losing their foothold in the Holy Land. Muslim forces had retaken Jerusalem in 1187 and had been steadily pushing Christian strongholds back. Now, a massive non-Muslim army was systematically destroying Islamic power. Some Crusader leaders sent congratulations to Hulagu. Others proposed alliances. The Prince of Antioch and the King of Armenia provided troops to fight alongside the Mongols. In their minds, the enemy of their enemy was their friend, and they'd deal with the Mongol problem after Islam was crushed. By early 1260, Islamic power in the Middle East appeared to be finished. The Abbasid Caliphate was destroyed. The Khwarezmian Empire was a memory. Syria was occupied. Persia was Mongol territory. And the next target was obvious: Egypt, the last major independent Islamic power, ruled by the Mamluk Sultanate. But here the story takes a turn, because the Mamluks were not like other armies the Mongols had faced. To understand why, we need to understand what a Mamluk actually was. The word Mamluk means owned or slave. The Mamluk system was one of the most unusual military institutions in history. It began in the 9th century when Muslim rulers, distrustful of free soldiers who might develop loyalty to generals or tribes, began purchasing boys from Central Asia and the Caucasus, converting them to Islam and training them in exclusive military academies. These weren't slaves in the agricultural or household sense. They were military slaves, and their training was legendary. A boy purchased into the Mamluk system would be taken from his family and culture at age 8 to 12. He would never see his homeland again. He would be placed in a military barracks with other boys from different tribes and regions, deliberately separated from anyone who shared his language or background. The purpose was to destroy all previous loyalties and create a new identity, Mamluk. For the next decade, these boys would undergo the most rigorous military training in the medieval world. They learned to fight with lance, sword, mace, and bow. But this wasn't casual training. A fully trained Mamluk was expected to master a technique called the Mamluk Furusiya, which combined horsemanship with weapons mastery at a level that seems almost superhuman by modern standards. A Mamluk cavalryman could shoot a bow accurately while galloping at full speed. He could shoot backwards over his shoulder while retreating. He could throw a lance and then draw his sword in a single fluid motion. He could control his horse with his knees alone, leaving both hands free for weapons. This training took years and required daily practice from childhood through adulthood. But the training wasn't just physical. Mamluks were educated in Islamic law, theology, literature, and military strategy. They were taught to read and write, unusual for soldiers in the medieval period. They studied the campaigns of great commanders. They learned siege warfare, logistics, and battlefield tactics. By the time a Mamluk completed his training in his early 20s, he was simultaneously a religious scholar, an elite warrior, and a tactical expert. And then, upon completion of his training, he was freed from slavery and became a full member of the Mamluk military caste with the right to own property and rise through the ranks based purely on merit. The Mamluk system created several unique advantages. First, Mamluks had no divided loyalties. They had no tribes to favor, no families to protect, no regional allegiances. Their only identity was as Mamluks, and their only loyalty was to the Sultan and the institution that had created them. Second, they were professional soldiers in an era when most armies were composed of part-time warriors or feudal levies. Being a Mamluk was a full-time career that lasted an entire lifetime. Third, they were genuinely elite. The intensive training from childhood created warriors who could execute complex maneuvers that would be impossible for soldiers with less preparation. But the Mamluk system also had unusual cultural effects. Because Mamluks couldn't pass their status to their children, sons of Mamluks were not automatically Mamluks themselves. There was no hereditary military aristocracy. Every generation, the system had to purchase new boys and train them from scratch. This meant that Mamluk culture was constantly being renewed with fresh talent from the steppes and Caucasus. And ironically, this meant that many Mamluks came from the same Central Asian regions that produced the Mongols. They spoke similar languages, understood steppe culture, and knew the tactics the Mongols used because they came from the same tradition. By 1250, the Mamluks had overthrown the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt and established their own sultanate. The Mamluk Sultanate was unusual in that it was explicitly a military oligarchy. The Sultan was elected from among the most powerful Mamluk generals. Power was maintained through military prowess, political skill, and the loyalty of Mamluk regiments. Succession was rarely peaceful. Most sultans were eventually overthrown or assassinated by rivals. But the system worked because it ensured that leadership always went to capable military commanders, not to incompetent heirs who happened to have the right father. In 1259, the Mamluk Sultan was Saif ad-Din Qutuz. His rise to power had been extraordinary even by Mamluk standards. Qutuz was originally a prince from the Khwarezmian royal family. As a child, he'd been captured when the Mongols destroyed his homeland. He'd been sold into slavery, purchased by the Mamluks, and trained in their system. So Qutuz had personal experience with Mongol conquest. He'd watched them destroy his family, his kingdom, and his civilization. He'd survived by being sold into slavery and had risen through sheer ability to become Sultan of Egypt. When Hulagu Khan's ambassadors arrived in Cairo in 1260, carrying the same ultimatum that had preceded the destruction of every other Islamic power, Qutuz read it with perfect understanding of what it meant. The letter was familiar in its arrogance and its threats. From the King of Kings in the East and West, the Great Khan, to Qutuz the Mamluk, who fled to escape our swords. You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire, and have purified the earth of the disorders that tainted it. We have conquered vast areas, massacring all the people. You cannot escape from the terror of our armies. Where can you flee? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts. Our hearts as hard as mountains. Our soldiers as numerous as sand. Fortresses will not detain us. We will cross over dry land. We will scale high mountains. Everywhere we have trod, blood has flowed. You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire and purified the earth of disorders. So submit to us before you regret it. If you resist, you will see your cities destroyed, your women taken, your children slaughtered, and your lands laid waste. Every kingdom that had received this ultimatum had either submitted or been destroyed. The Khwarezmian Empire had resisted and ceased to exist. The Abbasid Caliphate had hesitated and been annihilated. Damascus had surrendered and been occupied. Qutuz called his Mamluk generals together to discuss the response. Some argued for diplomacy, for buying time, for anything except open defiance. The Mongols had never been defeated in the region. Their army was unstoppable. Resistance meant facing the same fate as Baghdad. Qutuz listened to the arguments, and then he did something that shocked even his own generals. He had the Mongol ambassadors executed. Their bodies were cut in half and displayed on the walls of Cairo. In medieval diplomatic protocol, this was the ultimate declaration of war. Ambassadors were sacrosanct, protected by custom and religious law. Killing them meant you rejected not just the message but the entire framework of negotiation. It meant total war with no possibility of compromise. Some of Qutuz's generals were horrified. They argued he doomed Egypt to the same destruction that had befallen every other kingdom. But Qutuz understood something crucial about Mongol psychology and strategy. The Mongols offered generous terms to those who surrendered immediately because it was efficient. Taking cities by negotiation saved Mongol lives and resources. But those generous terms evaporated the moment you showed weakness or hesitation. The Khwarezmian Shah had tried to negotiate and his empire was destroyed. The Caliph of Baghdad had surrendered and was trampled to death in a carpet. The pattern was clear. The Mongols respected immediate submission or fierce resistance, but they had contempt for weakness or vacillation. By executing the ambassadors, Qutuz was making a calculated gamble. He was signaling that Egypt would fight to the death, that there would be no negotiation, and that the Mongols would pay in blood for every mile of Egyptian territory. This might convince the Mongols that Egypt was too costly to conquer, or it might enrage them into total war. Either way, it was better than the slow strangulation of negotiating from a position of weakness. But Qutuz also understood that defiant gestures meant nothing without military capability to back them up. He began immediate preparations for war. He assembled the entire Mamluk military force, calling in garrisons from across Egypt. He released political prisoners, including Mamluk generals he'd previously exiled or imprisoned, because he needed unity and couldn't afford internal divisions. He opened the treasury to purchase weapons, horses, and supplies. And he sent scouts north to gather intelligence on the Mongol forces in Syria. What they reported back was both terrifying and promising. The Mongol army in Syria was formidable. Perhaps 20,000 elite cavalry under the command of General Kitbuqa Noyan. Kitbuqa was a Nestorian Christian from the Naiman tribe, a veteran of the Mongol campaigns in China and Persia. He'd fought at the siege of Baghdad. He'd helped conquer Syria. He was experienced, ruthless, and supremely confident. But the scouts also reported something unexpected. The bulk of the Mongol army, perhaps 100,000 troops under Hulagu Khan himself, had left Syria and was marching east. The reason was political. In 1259, the great Khan Mongke had died during a campaign in China. This triggered a succession crisis. Hulagu Khan, as a grandson of Genghis Khan and brother of the dead Great Khan, had a stake in who would rule the empire. He took the majority of his forces and marched back toward Mongolia to secure his interests in the succession. He left Kitbuqa with perhaps 20,000 troops to hold Syria and continue operations if opportunities arose. This changed everything. The Mamluks could potentially field an army of similar size to the Mongol force in Syria. For the first time, there wouldn't be overwhelming numerical superiority. It would be skill against skill, tactics against tactics. The best warriors the Mamluks could produce against the army that had conquered half the world. Qutuz assembled his generals and proposed an audacious plan. Instead of waiting in Egypt for the Mongols to invade, they would march north and meet them in the field. The strategic logic was sound. Waiting meant giving the Mongols time to gather intelligence, recruit local allies, and choose the battlefield. Marching north meant the Mamluks could select the terrain and potentially catch the Mongols dispersed. But it was also incredibly risky. If the Mamluks lost the field battle, they'd have no fallback defenses. The entire military force would be destroyed in a single engagement, and Egypt would be defenseless. Qutuz was gambling everything on one battle. One of the generals who spoke in favor of the offensive was Baybars al-Bundukdari, a name that would become legendary. Baybars was in his late 30s in 1260, a Kipchak Turk from the steppes north of the Black Sea. He'd been sold into slavery as a teenager, trained in the Mamluk system, and risen through ability and ruthlessness to become one of the most powerful generals in Egypt. Baybars had actually been sold multiple times before ending up with the Mamluks because he had a cataract in one eye that made buyers think he was defective. The defect hadn't stopped him from becoming one of the most feared warriors in the Mamluk army. Baybars understood the Mongols better than almost anyone in the Mamluk leadership. He came from the same Central Asian steppes that had produced the Mongol armies. He spoke their languages. He understood their culture and tactics. He'd fought them before during Mongol raids into his homeland. And crucially, he hated them with a personal passion that went beyond political enmity. Mongols had destroyed his people, scattered his tribe, and turned him into a slave. Everything he'd built, every victory he'd won, was in defiance of the catastrophe the Mongols had inflicted on his childhood world. Baybars argued that the Mamluks had to fight now, while the Mongol force was relatively small, before Hulagu could return with reinforcements. He argued that the psychological impact of defeating the Mongols would be immense, that it would inspire resistance across the Islamic world, and potentially destabilize Mongol control of Syria and Iraq. And he argued that Mamluk heavy cavalry, properly deployed, could defeat Mongol light cavalry in the right terrain. The steppes favored mobility and the feigned retreat. Broken terrain, hills, and valleys favored disciplined formations and shock charges. Choose the right battlefield, and the Mamluks had a chance. Qutuz agreed. In July 1260, he assembled an army of approximately 20,000 Mamluk cavalry. This was almost the entire military force of Egypt. There were no significant reserves. If this army was destroyed, Egypt would fall. The stakes could not have been higher. Qutuz addressed the army before the march, and according to Islamic chronicles, he gave a speech that acknowledged the desperate nature of the situation. He told them that they were the last shield of Islam, that if they failed, the entire Muslim world would fall to the Mongols as Persia and Iraq had fallen. He promised that he would fight personally in the front ranks, that he would share every danger with the common soldier. And he told them that victory or martyrdom were both honorable, but surrender was unthinkable. The army marched north through Sinai in late summer heat. The logistics were brutal. They had to carry enough water and supplies to cross the desert, but not so much that it would slow them down. Speed was essential. If the Mongols learned that the entire Mamluk army was in the desert, they could ambush the column or simply avoid battle and wait for thirst and heat exhaustion to do their work. Qutuz pushed the army hard, covering the distance in record time. They emerged from Sinai and entered Palestine in late August, and immediately Qutuz sent Baybars ahead with a vanguard of about 1,000 cavalry. Baybars' mission was threefold: scout the Mongol positions, gather intelligence on their numbers and disposition, and, if possible, make contact with the Mongol advance forces to gauge their readiness. This was extraordinarily dangerous. If Baybars' vanguard was caught by the main Mongol army, they'd be annihilated. But it was necessary. Mamluks needed to know where Kitbuqa was and what he was planning. Baybars pushed north rapidly, his scouts fanning out across the countryside. What they found was both encouraging and concerning. The Mongol army was dispersed across Syria, with garrisons in major cities and mobile forces patrolling the countryside. Kitbuqa's main force was in the Jezreel Valley, an area near Nazareth in northern Palestine. The Mongols didn't appear to know that the main Mamluk army was approaching. They thought they were dealing with normal border patrols, or perhaps a small raid. This meant surprise was possible, but Baybars also discovered something worrying. The Mongols had allies. Christian forces from the Crusader states and Armenian contingents were cooperating with the Mongols, not in large numbers, but enough to provide scouts and local intelligence. And there were Muslim collaborators as well, governors and tribal leaders who'd submitted to Mongol authority and were now providing troops and information. The Mamluks couldn't count on local support. They were marching into potentially hostile territory. Baybars sent messengers back to Qutuz with the intelligence and continued north with his vanguard. Near the town of Ain Jalut, which translates to Spring of Goliath, named after the biblical giant allegedly killed nearby by David, Baybars found what he was looking for: perfect terrain for an ambush. The Jezreel Valley at that point was relatively narrow, with hills rising on both sides. It wasn't open steppe where Mongol cavalry could maneuver freely. It was broken ground where formations mattered more than mobility. Baybars' military mind immediately saw the possibilities. If the main Mamluk force could hide behind the hills, and if his vanguard could lure the Mongols into the valley, they could execute a classic double envelopment. The Mongols would be caught between Baybars' force ahead and Qutuz's heavy cavalry on the flanks. It was the same tactic that Hannibal had used at Cannae to destroy a Roman army, and the same principle that the Mongols themselves used in their feigned retreats. The irony would be using Mongol psychology against them. When Qutuz arrived with the main force, Baybars presented the plan. It was risky to the point of insanity. The vanguard would have to engage the entire Mongol army and then execute a fighting retreat for hours, maybe an entire day, staying just ahead of the Mongols but not so far ahead that they'd give up the chase. If the retreat became a real rout, if the vanguard panicked and scattered, the plan would collapse and the entire army would be destroyed piecemeal. The vanguard would need perfect discipline under the most intense pressure imaginable. Qutuz looked at the terrain, considered the options, and approved the plan. The main Mamluk force, approximately 15,000 heavy cavalry, moved into positions behind the hills on both sides of the valley. They were under strict orders to remain hidden and silent. No fires, no movement that could be spotted by scouts. Absolute concealment. If the Mongols discovered the ambush before it was sprung, they'd simply avoid the valley and the opportunity would be lost. Baybars took his vanguard, now reinforced to perhaps 1,500 cavalry, and positioned them in the valley near Ain Jalut. And then they waited for the Mongols to come. The wait must have been psychologically excruciating. Every hour that passed was another hour the Mongols might discover the trap. Every scout that appeared on the horizon might be the one who spotted the hidden forces. The entire plan depended on Mongol overconfidence, on their assumption that they faced only a small Mamluk raid, rather than the entire Egyptian army. On September 3rd, 1260, Mongol scouts spotted Baybars' vanguard in the valley. They rode back to report to Kitbuqa. The Mongol general received the news with satisfaction rather than concern. A Mamluk force in Palestine this far north could only mean one thing: either a raid or a scouting force from a larger army still days away. Either way, the tactical response was the same: send cavalry to engage and destroy them. Kitbuqa assembled his forces and marched toward Ain Jalut. He had perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 cavalry, veterans of campaigns from China to Syria, warriors who'd never lost a major battle in the Middle East. When the Mongol army appeared on the horizon, Baybars' vanguard would have seen a sight that had terrified kingdoms. Thousands of riders, each leading multiple horses so they could switch mounts and maintain speed for days. Each warrior carried a composite bow and multiple quivers of arrows, along with a saber, lance, and sometimes a lasso for pulling enemies from their horses. They rode in organized units with banners and drums signaling commands. This was the army that had burned Baghdad, that had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, that had made the word Mongol synonymous with death. Baybars arrayed his vanguard in a defensive formation and waited. The Mongols advanced, and when they came within bow range, they did what Mongol armies always did. They began shooting. Thousands of arrows arced through the air. Mongol composite bows, made from horn, sinew, and wood, could shoot farther and harder than most medieval bows. A Mongol archer could shoot accurately at 300 meters and could pierce armor at closer range. The arrow storm was designed to break enemy formations and cause casualties before melee combat even began. Mamluk cavalry wore heavy armor: lamellar armor, chainmail, helmets, shields. The arrows killed horses and found gaps in armor, but the vanguard held formation. And critically, they began to shoot back. Mamluks were trained archers as well, and while they couldn't match Mongol rate of fire, their arrows were just as deadly. The two forces exchanged volleys, cavalry maneuvering and firing, a deadly dance that was the standard opening of steppe warfare. Then Baybars made his move. He ordered a slow withdrawal. Not a rout, not a flight, but a deliberate, fighting retreat. The vanguard would engage, exchange arrows, and then pull back 100 meters. The Mongols would advance, the vanguard would turn and engage again, inflict casualties, and pull back again. To the Mongols, this looked exactly like what they'd seen dozens of times before. An enemy force that had engaged, realized they were outmatched, and was trying to retreat in good order before being annihilated. Kitbuqa, seeing the Mamluks withdrawing, made the obvious tactical decision. He ordered pursuit. The Mongol cavalry surged forward, trying to close the distance and turn the Mamluk retreat into a rout. If they could get among the Mamluk cavalry and break their formation, it would become a massacre. But Baybars was too skilled to let that happen. He kept his force just out of reach, close enough that the Mongols believed they could catch them, far enough that they couldn't actually close the distance. For hours, this deadly game continued. The Mamluks would turn and fight, inflict casualties, and withdraw. The Mongols would charge forward, try to envelop the flanks, and find the Mamluks just slipping away. Both sides were taking casualties. Horses were dying, men were being hit by arrows, but critically, the Mongols were moving deeper into the valley, farther from their own support, their horses tiring from the constant charge and pursuit. The psychological pressure on Baybars and his vanguard must have been unbearable. They were 1,000 men facing 20,000. Every instinct would be screaming at them to run, to scatter, to save themselves. But if they broke, if the retreat became a real flight, the entire plan would collapse. The main Mamluk army would be discovered in their hiding positions and destroyed. Everything depended on maintaining discipline under the most intense pressure imaginable. Behind the hills, Qutuz waited with 15,000 cavalry. They could hear the sounds of battle in the valley. The drums, the shouts, the thunder of hooves. They knew their comrades were fighting and dying, and they had to stay hidden, stay silent, and wait for the perfect moment. Qutuz had positioned scouts on the hilltops who could see the valley and signal when the Mongol army was fully committed. The moment came in the afternoon. The Mongol force had pushed deep into the valley, pursuing what they thought was a defeated enemy. Their formation was stretched out, the fastest cavalry ahead, the rest strung out behind. They were focused entirely on the Mamluks ahead of them, and Qutuz gave the signal. 15,000 Mamluk heavy cavalry exploded over the hills from both sides of the valley. The ground shook with the thunder of their charge. These weren't the light cavalry the Mongols had been fighting. These were heavy shock cavalry on war horses, armored knights designed for devastating impact. The Mongols, focused on pursuing Baybars, suddenly found themselves caught between the vanguard ahead and massive cavalry wings crashing into their flanks. The collision was cataclysmic. The weight and momentum of armored cavalry smashing into the Mongol flanks was like a battering ram. Lances shattered shields and pierced armor. Horses crashed into horses. The disciplined Mongol formations, stretched thin by the pursuit, began to fragment under the impact. This was the Mamluk specialty, the tactic they'd trained for their entire lives. The overwhelming heavy cavalry charge that broke enemy lines through pure physical force. The Mongols tried to execute their standard response to being surrounded. Scatter, use mobility to escape the encirclement, regroup, and counterattack from a better position. The valley was too narrow. The hills blocked escape routes. And Baybar's vanguard, instead of continuing to retreat, had turned and was now charging back into the fight. The Mongols were trapped in a box, with enemies on 3 sides and terrain blocking the 4th. What followed was not a battle of maneuver and tactics, it was a brutal melee. Thousands of cavalry warriors hacking at each other in close combat. Swords crashed against shields, lances pierced armor, horses trampled fallen warriors. The noise would have been deafening, the clash of metal, the screams of wounded men and horses, the shouts of officers trying to organize their units amid chaos. The Mongols were veterans, disciplined, and ferocious. They didn't break easily. Individual units fought with desperate courage, knowing that surrender meant death. Kitbuqa rallied his forces repeatedly, leading charges personally to try to break through the Mamluk encirclement. The battle swayed back and forth, neither side gaining decisive advantage. Mongol cavalry would punch through a section of the Mamluk line, only to be surrounded and cut down. Mamluk charges would drive deep into Mongol formations, only to be met by fierce counterattacks. This was the kind of battle where leadership mattered enormously. In the chaos and confusion of melee combat, soldiers look to their commanders for direction. If commanders flee or are killed, armies disintegrate. If commanders fight courageously and maintain order, armies can sustain incredible punishment and keep fighting. Both Qutuz and Kitbuqa understood this instinctively. At a critical moment in the battle, Qutuz did something extraordinary that became legendary in Islamic military history. He saw a section of his line wavering under a fierce Mongol counterattack. His troops were falling back, and if that section collapsed, the Mongols might break through and escape the trap. Qutuz rode forward, and then he did something no Sultan had done in living memory. He threw off his helmet so his troops could see his face, and he shouted, "Wa Islama," which translates roughly as, "O Muslims," "O Islam," or "By Islam." Then he personally charged into the Mongol lines. A sultan, the supreme commander, the ruler of Egypt, fighting in the front ranks like a common soldier. The impact on Mamluk morale was electric. If the sultan himself was willing to die for this cause, how could they not follow? The entire army surged forward with renewed fury. The wavering line stabilized and then pushed back. The Mongol counterattack was broken. But the battle was far from over. The Mongols continued to fight with a ferocity born of desperation. They knew what happened to defeated Mongol armies. There would be no quarter, no mercy. Every man was fighting for his life. Small groups of Mongol cavalry fought back to back, surrounded by enemies, selling their lives as dearly as possible. The valley became a slaughterhouse, bodies and wounded horses creating obstacles that made maneuvering even more difficult. The turning point came when a section of the Mongol line finally broke under sustained pressure. Once the formation fractured, the collapse accelerated. Individual units, seeing the battle lost, began trying to retreat. But retreating from a close melee is extraordinarily difficult. You have to disengage from the enemy without being cut down from behind, maintain some formation so you don't get hunted down individually, and find an escape route. The Mongols, trapped in the valley with limited exits, couldn't execute an organized withdrawal. The retreat became a rout. Mongol discipline, which had held through hours of brutal combat, finally collapsed. Cavalry broke and fled in all directions, trying to escape the killing ground. Mamluk cavalry pursued relentlessly. This was the most dangerous moment for fleeing soldiers. A man running away can't defend himself. Mamluk lancers rode down fleeing Mongols, spearing them from behind. Archers shot at clustered targets. Small groups of Mongols that tried to make stands were surrounded and annihilated. Kitbuqa, the Mongol general, refused to flee. According to multiple sources, both Mongol and Islamic, he fought until his horse was killed under him, then continued fighting on foot. When he was finally surrounded and captured, he showed no fear. He was brought before Qutuz, bloodied and defiant. According to the chronicler Rashid al-Din, Kitbuqa told Qutuz, "If I die, know that the armies of the Mongols will not rest until they have avenged me. From east and west, they will come like mountains, crushing everything in their path." Qutuz, recognizing that keeping a captured Mongol general alive would only invite ransom demands and diplomatic complications, ordered his immediate execution. Kitbuqa was beheaded on the field of battle. His death marked the definitive end of the Mongol army in Syria. By evening on September 3, 1260, the Mongol force that had terrorized the Middle East had been effectively destroyed. The battlefield was a scene of carnage. Thousands of bodies, both Mongol and Mamluk, lay scattered across the valley. Wounded horses screamed, dying men begged for water or mercy. The Mamluks had won, but they'd paid a price. Estimates suggest they suffered 1,000 to 2,000 casualties. Against any other enemy, this would be considered heavy losses. Against the Mongols, it was an acceptable exchange. But the true significance of the battle wasn't the casualties or even the tactical victory. It was the psychological impact. For 50 years, the Mongol Empire had seemed invincible. They'd destroyed every army that faced them in open battle. They'd crushed the Khwarezmian Empire, annihilated Baghdad, conquered Russia, and devastated Eastern Europe. The very word Mongol inspired terror. Cities surrendered at the sight of their banners. Armies fled rather than face them in battle. Ain Jalut shattered that myth. The Mongols had been defeated, not through some fluke or accident, but in open battle through superior tactics and comparable military skill. The news spread across the Islamic world with incredible speed. Damascus, which had surrendered to the Mongols months earlier, immediately expelled the Mongol garrison and welcomed Mamluk forces. Aleppo followed. Cities across Syria rose in revolt against Mongol occupation. Governors who'd submitted to Hulagu Khan suddenly pledged loyalty to Qutuz. The psychological reversal was total. Before Ain Jalut, the question was whether Islam could survive the Mongol onslaught. After Ain Jalut, the question was whether the Mongols could maintain their western territories. The battle hadn't just stopped Mongol expansion westward. It had demonstrated that they could be beaten, and that demonstration undermined their entire strategic doctrine based on terror and inevitability. Military commanders across the Islamic world began studying what the Mamluks had done. The tactics were analyzed and copied. Choose terrain that negated Mongol mobility. Use heavy cavalry to break their formations. Maintain discipline during retreats. Fight with the confidence of men who believe victory is possible. These lessons would inform Islamic military strategy for generations. But the story doesn't end with the victory. In fact, the most dramatic chapter was yet to come. Qutuz had saved Islamic civilization. He was a hero celebrated across the Muslim world. Letters of congratulation poured in from every corner of the Islamic world that had survived Mongol conquest. The Sultan, who had gambled everything and won, was now the most powerful figure in the Middle East. He lived for exactly 1 month after the battle. On October 16, 1260, Qutuz was returning to Egypt with his victorious army. They stopped to hunt hares in the desert near Gaza, a traditional leisure activity for mounted warriors. A group of Mamluk generals approached Qutuz, led by Baybars. They claimed to have caught a hare and wanted to present it to the Sultan as a gift. As Qutuz reached out to take the hare, the generals drew their weapons and stabbed him to death. The assassination was sudden, brutal, and meticulously planned. Qutuz's bodyguards were either complicit or too shocked to intervene. The Sultan, who had defied the Mongol Empire, who had executed their ambassadors, who had charged personally into battle, was murdered by his own generals, in a hunting accident that wasn't an accident at all. The reasons for the assassination are complex and debated by historians. The official explanation was political rivalry and old grudges. Baybars had served under a previous sultan named Aybak. Qutuz had overthrown Aybak and taken power. Baybars, the story goes, was avenging his former master and settling political scores. Some sources suggest that Qutuz had promised Baybars the governorship of Aleppo as a reward for his role at Ain Jalut, then reneged on the promise, and Baybars killed him in rage. But other historians suggest darker motives. Qutuz had centralized power and was planning to eliminate potential rivals, Baybars included. Baybars might have assassinated Qutuz in self-defense, striking before he could be struck. Still others argue that Baybars simply saw an opportunity to seize power and took it. Qutuz had no sons, no obvious heir, and the Mamluk system had no rules for peaceful succession. Assassination and military coups were standard mechanisms for changing leadership. Whatever the true motivation, Baybars moved quickly to consolidate power. He declared himself Sultan immediately after the assassination. He had the support of key Mamluk generals who'd been part of the conspiracy. And critically, he had the army's respect as the general who'd lured the Mongols into the trap at Ain Jalut. The army accepted his claim to the Sultanate, partly because resisting would have meant civil war at a moment when Egypt needed unity. And here's where the story becomes almost unbearably ironic. Baybars, the man who murdered the hero of Ain Jalut, went on to become one of the greatest rulers in Islamic history. His reign lasted 17 years, and during that time he accomplished extraordinary things. He crushed the remaining Crusader states, capturing stronghold after stronghold that had resisted Islamic armies for centuries. Antioch, which had been Christian since the First Crusade in 1098, fell to Baybars in 1268. He reduced the Kingdom of Jerusalem to a tiny coastal strip around Acre. He defeated multiple Mongol invasion attempts, proving that Ain Jalut wasn't a fluke, but the beginning of sustained Mamluk military superiority. Baybars also reformed the Mamluk military system, improving training, standardizing equipment, and creating a sophisticated intelligence network that spanned the known world. He established a postal system using carrier pigeons that could send messages across the empire faster than any rival could move troops. He built fortifications, repaired mosques, patronized scholars, and positioned himself as the protector of Islam after the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate. Perhaps most significantly, Baybars found a surviving member of the Abbasid family and installed him as a puppet caliph in Cairo. This was pure political theater, but brilliant theater. The Abbasid Caliphate had been destroyed when Baghdad fell, and the Islamic world had been without a caliph, without the symbolic head of Sunni Islam, for years. By installing a new Abbasid caliph, even a powerless one, Baybars positioned himself as the defender of Islamic legitimacy and the continuator of the caliphate tradition. It was propaganda, but effective propaganda. So history gives us this deeply uncomfortable scenario. Qutuz was the hero who saved Islam at Ain Jalut and was murdered by his subordinate a month later. Baybars was the murderer who then completed the work Qutuz had started and became a legendary ruler. Both things are true. The man who defied the Mongols was betrayed. The man who betrayed him defeated the Mongols repeatedly and built an empire. How do we judge this? Traditional Islamic history struggled with this question. Some portrayed Qutuz as a tragic hero and Baybars as a villain whose later accomplishments didn't excuse his treachery. Others downplayed the assassination or claimed Qutuz had become tyrannical and deserved his fate. Modern historians tend to take a more nuanced view. Both men were products of the Mamluk system, which was inherently unstable and violent in its succession mechanisms. Assassination wasn't an aberration. It was how power transferred in a military oligarchy with no hereditary succession. The long-term consequences of Ain Jalut rippled through world history. The Mongols never conquered Egypt or pushed farther west. The boundary established in 1260 became permanent. The Mongol Ilkhanate controlled Persia and Iraq. The Mamluk Sultanate controlled Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land. They would fight border wars for decades, but neither could decisively defeat the other. This division had profound effects. The Mongol territories in Persia eventually converted to Islam and integrated with Persian culture, creating the Ilkhanate that was Mongol in origin but Islamic and Persian in culture. The Mamluk territories remained independent, preserving a line of Islamic civilization unbroken by Mongol conquest. When the Mongol Empire fragmented in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Mamluk Sultanate remained strong and intact. The battle also affected Europe indirectly. If the Mamluks had lost, the Mongols would have conquered Egypt, controlled the Mediterranean coast, and been positioned to invade North Africa and potentially southern Europe. The Crusader states, which had naively allied with the Mongols hoping they'd destroy Islam, would have found themselves facing a Mongol empire that controlled everything from Poland to Ethiopia. Instead, the Mamluk victory confined the Mongols to territories east of the Mediterranean and removed the existential threat to Europe and North Africa. Some historians argue that Ain Jalut was one of the most important battles in world history, ranking alongside Tours in 732, which stopped Arab expansion into Europe, and Vienna in 1529 and 1683, which stopped Ottoman expansion. The argument is that without Ain Jalut, the entire medieval world would have been fundamentally different. The Mongols would have controlled the Mediterranean, the trade routes, and possibly North Africa. European history, African history, and Islamic history would all have diverged dramatically from the timeline we know. Other historians are more cautious, arguing that the Mongol Empire was already overextended by 1260, and probably couldn't have conquered and held Egypt even if they'd won at Ain Jalut. The logistical challenges of controlling territory from Korea to Egypt were insurmountable with medieval technology. The empire was already fragmenting into regional khanates. Ain Jalut accelerated this process, but didn't cause it. But regardless of these academic debates, the immediate impact was undeniable. The Mongol advance westward was stopped permanently. The myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. Islamic civilization, which had seemed doomed after the fall of Baghdad, survived and eventually thrived. The Mamluk Sultanate became the dominant power in the Middle East for the next 250 years. The Mongols would attempt revenge invasions. In 1281, Mongol forces invaded Syria again and were defeated at the Second Battle of Homs. In 1299 and 1300, they invaded twice more and were beaten back both times. Every invasion followed the same pattern: initial Mongol success, Mamluk counterattack, Mongol withdrawal. The Mamluks had learned the lessons of Ain Jalut and applied them consistently. Choose good terrain, maintain discipline, use heavy cavalry shock tactics, and never give the Mongols the open-field mobile battle they excelled at. Eventually, the Mongol Ilkhanate stopped trying to conquer Syria. They converted to Islam, intermarried with Persian nobility, and became more interested in administration than conquest. The fierce steppe warriors who'd terrified the world became bureaucrats and patrons of Persian art and culture. The transformation took 2 generations, but by 1300, the Mongols in Persia were barely recognizable as descendants of Genghis Khan's hordes. Meanwhile, the Mamluk Sultanate continued to dominate the region. They finally destroyed the last Crusader stronghold at Acre in 1291, ending the Crusader presence in the Holy Land after 2 centuries. They controlled the critical trade routes between Asia, Europe, and Africa. They patronized Islamic scholarship and architecture, building the mosques and madrasas that still define Cairo's skyline today. But the Mamluk system carried the seeds of its own instability. Because power couldn't be inherited and there was no clear succession mechanism, every sultan lived under the threat of assassination or coup. The average Mamluk sultan ruled for about 7 years before being overthrown or killed. Baybars himself, despite his military genius and administrative skill, probably died of poisoned kumis, fermented mare's milk, in 1277. Some sources suggest he was poisoned by rivals. Others claim it was an accident. But the pattern continued: violent rise to power, a reign of varying success, and violent removal from power. This chronic instability eventually weakened the Sultanate. By the early 16th century, the Mamluks had fallen behind in military technology. They still relied on cavalry and traditional weapons, while the Ottoman Empire had embraced gunpowder, cannons, and muskets. In 1517, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I invaded Egypt with an army equipped with firearms. Mamluk cavalry, still using tactics that had worked at Ain Jalut 250 years earlier, were annihilated by Ottoman cannons and arquebuses at the Battle of Ridania. The Mamluk Sultanate ended, absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. But even in defeat, the Mamluk legacy persisted. The Ottomans kept the Mamluk administrative system in place in Egypt. Mamluks continued to serve as governors and military commanders under Ottoman authority. And when the Ottoman Empire weakened in the 18th century, Mamluks again seized power in Egypt, creating a neo-Mamluk regime that lasted until Napoleon's invasion in 1798 finally destroyed their political power forever. So what do we make of Ain Jalut and its aftermath? At one level, it's a straightforward military history. One army defeated another through superior tactics and leadership. But at another level, it's a story about the fragility of empires, the role of individual decisions in shaping history, and the complex relationship between military success and moral judgment. Qutuz made the decision to execute the Mongol ambassadors, knowing it meant total war. Was that brave or reckless? He gambled the entire Egyptian army on a single battle. Was that brilliant strategy or catastrophic risk-taking? He charged personally into the fight at the critical moment. Was that inspiring leadership or irresponsible grandstanding that could have gotten him killed and lost the battle? History remembers him as a hero because he won. If he'd lost, we'd remember him as the fool who doomed Egypt through arrogance and poor judgment. Baybars executed the plan at Ain Jalut with discipline and skill that bordered on genius. His fighting retreat lured the Mongols into the perfect trap. But he also murdered his sultan a month later to seize power. Does his military brilliance excuse or mitigate the betrayal? Does his 17-year reign of successful rule justify the assassination? Can we separate the tactical genius from the political murderer? These aren't easy questions, and they don't have clean answers. The medieval world didn't operate on modern ethical frameworks. Political assassination was a standard tool of statecraft. Military leaders were expected to seize opportunities for power. The Mamluk system explicitly had no peaceful succession mechanism. Baybars did what ambitious Mamluk generals were supposed to do: eliminate rivals and take power. But Qutuz wasn't just any rival. He was the man who'd saved Egypt, who'd defied the Mongols, who'd won the most important battle in a generation. Killing him a month after that victory seems especially cynical, even by medieval standards. And yet, Baybars then used that power to accomplish extraordinary things. He defended Egypt against multiple Mongol invasions. He crushed the Crusader states. He reformed the military. He patronized scholarship. He strengthened Islam at a moment when it was vulnerable. Perhaps the lesson is that history is morally complex and resists simple narratives. Heroes commit crimes. Villains accomplish great things. The same man can be both a brilliant general and a treacherous murderer. The same battle can be both a triumph of courage and a prelude to betrayal. And we, looking back from centuries later, have to hold multiple truths in our minds simultaneously and resist the temptation to simplify into clean moral categories. What we can say with certainty is that Ain Jalut mattered. It stopped the Mongol expansion westward. It proved they could be defeated. It saved the Mamluk Sultanate and preserved Islamic power in the Middle East. And it gave us one of history's most dramatic stories: the slave who became a sultan, the general who became a hero, the hero who was betrayed, and the betrayer who became a legend. The valley near Ain Jalut today is quiet. Modern Israel controls the territory. The Jezreel Valley is farmland, peaceful and productive. Few tourists visit the site. There's no grand monument commemorating the battle. Most people driving through the area have no idea that one of history's most important battles happened there. But for one day in September 1260, that valley was the center of the world. The fate of civilizations hung in the balance. Two armies, representing completely different military systems and cultures, clashed in brutal combat, and when the sun set on September 3rd, the world was different. The unstoppable army had been stopped. The invincible warriors had been defeated, and the course of history had shifted. The Mongols learned from the defeat. They never again assumed that numerical superiority and reputation would guarantee victory. They became more cautious in their expansion, more willing to negotiate rather than conquer. The psychological weapon of terror, which had been so effective for 50 years, was blunted. You can't terrify people into submission if they know you can be beaten. The Islamic world learned different lessons. Ain Jalut showed that military resistance was possible, that the Mongol war machine wasn't supernatural or unstoppable. This knowledge inspired resistance movements and gave hope to communities living under Mongol occupation. It also created a template for how to fight the Mongols successfully. Don't face them on open steppes, choose broken terrain, use heavy cavalry shock charges, maintain discipline. These tactics were studied and replicated, and both sides learned that battlefield victory didn't guarantee lasting peace or stability. The Mamluks won at Ain Jalut, but then descended into internal political violence that killed their sultan and created chronic succession crises. Mongols lost at Ain Jalut, but eventually conquered parts of Syria anyway, through diplomacy and conversion. Military power could seize territory, but holding territory required administrative skill, political legitimacy, and cultural integration. These are lessons that echo through military history to the present day. Superior tactics can defeat superior numbers. Morale and leadership matter as much as equipment and training. Psychological factors, the belief in victory, or the expectation of defeat, shape battles as much as physical factors. And winning the battle doesn't mean winning the war, let alone winning the peace. If Qutuz could have seen the future, if he'd known he had only 1 month to live after his greatest triumph, would he have done anything differently? Would he have been more ruthless in eliminating rivals like Baybars? Would he have been more generous in sharing power and rewards? Or would he have made exactly the same choices, believing that saving Egypt justified any personal risk? If Baybars could have known that history would remember him primarily as the man who murdered Qutuz, despite his 17 years of successful rule, would he have chosen a different path to power? Would he have waited for Qutuz to die naturally, or be overthrown by someone else? Or would he have made the same calculation, that seizing power immediately was worth the moral stain? We can't know. We can only observe what happened and try to understand it. Two men, both military geniuses, both shaped by the brutal Mamluk system, both committed to defending Islam against the Mongol threat. They collaborated to win the most important battle of their era. Then, one killed the other in a power struggle, and the killer went on to complete the work they'd started together. It's a story without a clean moral. It's history in its rawest form. Human beings making desperate choices in impossible circumstances, achieving extraordinary things while committing terrible acts, leaving legacies that inspire and horrify in equal measure. The Muslim general who humiliated the unstoppable Mongols was named Qutuz. He died in the desert a month after his victory, murdered by his own general. The general who executed the plan at Ain Jalut was named Baybars. He became Sultan, defeated the Mongols repeatedly, crushed the Crusaders, and ruled for 17 years before probably being poisoned by rivals. Both men shaped history. Both men were shaped by the violent system that created them. And both deserve to be remembered, not as simple heroes or villains, but as complex human beings who lived in desperate times and made choices that still echo through history. The battle that saved a civilization happened because one man refused to surrender and another man knew how to win. That the first man was murdered by the second man doesn't erase the victory. It just reminds us that history is never as simple as the stories we tell about it.